February 1945, Northern Germany. The orders were plain and cold. Reconnaissance units were to maintain mobility, avoid civilian entanglements that could slow columns, and report non-combatant findings to headquarters for disposition. Between the lines lay a harder instruction: survive and keep your unit intact. For Sergeant James McKnight, the lines meant nothing against the sound he could not ignore. If this episode matters to you, stay with it to the end. And if you follow these stories, consider subscribing and leaving a like so more of them can be told. They had been at the farmhouse for 2 nights, an anonymous cluster of beams and a sagging roof that served as a vantage point over a road threaded with ice. McKnight had been assigned to reconnaissance in the flat, pocked country, to count obstacles, note signs of enemy movement, and to be invisible. His squad was lean: Corporal Davies at his side, Private Wilson tending the radio, Private Patterson, who kept a small photograph of his sister tucked into his tunic, and Kowalski, who moved like an old cart horse and kept hands and words to himself. They were Canadians, scratched and lean, with the faces of men who had known cold all their lives. McKnight was from Manitoba. He knew winter the way a farmer knew a plow. The wind came down the road in a white hiss. It moved across the ruined fields and through the ruined bones of towns and whistled at the farmhouse until the panes rattled. Snow had sealed footprints from earlier that day. The unit's truck sat half buried at the hedge, its engine cooling, its canvas cover creased like the back of a sleeping animal. In the brief, breath-stealing light of late afternoon, they were to move on, to slip toward areas marked as priority for reconnaissance and then return with reports. There was no instruction to stop and search cellars or to ferry civilians. That was the policy, and policy was how men survived orders and how commanders kept the larger war machine from folding under the weight of every human claim. The first sound was faint, almost lost under the wind. A thin, intermittent crying, like something behind a wall. McKnight heard it and sat up. He had the kind of hearing people who grew up under wide skies get. Small noises traveled farther across empty fields. He looked at Davies and gestured, barely moving his lips. "Did you hear that?" Davies asked, low, the question less about confirmation than permission to act. Private Patterson had his gloved hands on his knees. He listened with the awkward intensity of the youngest, the one who had not yet learned to mask what he felt. Even Kowalski had tilted his head. Wilson kept his hands away from the radio, but his eyes were sharp. He could sense a change in the room the way a dog could smell rain. It did not look like a trap, too hesitant, too human, but the very uncertainty was its own danger. They moved light and quick, the way men in winter learned to move when every wasted breath was taxed. The truck idled. They took scarves and a roll of blankets. McKnight left his kit behind, taking only what he thought would get them through a short detour. The road back toward the last village was cut through with shell craters and frozen mud. They went in twos, keeping the ditch between them as cover, the world reduced to the crunch of snow under boots and the occasional clink of metal. The cry came again, clearer now, no longer a trick of the wind. It had the wet edge of very young throats. It led them to a schoolhouse, or what had been a schoolhouse. The walls on one side were peeled back by blast. A roof beam lay like a fallen mast. Smoke trailed from one corner, and the smell of burned paper hung in the air. At the back, a cellar entrance sagged open, the trapdoor black with soot. McKnight felt the hair on his neck climb as they approached. He was a soldier, and had done his share of grim things. This was not a matter of heroics, but of judgment and speed. They found the basement by the stairway. 18 children huddled against one another beneath shawls and torn coats, eyes wide with frost and shock. A small boy sat apart at the foot of the stairs, his lips blue, his breath shallow, hands drawn into his sleeves as if to trap what warmth remained. A girl no older than 8 clung to a ragged doll, its face singed. The children were not all the same age. Some held each other like nests. Others stared at the cold walls as if listening for some voice that had left them. They smelled of smoke, starch, and the particular sourness of long fear kept close to the skin. The sight cut through McKnight with the bluntness of an axe. For a moment nothing was said. The men moved like they had been trained to move. Medical checks first, quick and clinical. Wilson took off his gloves and pressed his hand to the boy's wrist. It was a slow, distant pulse. McKnight crouched, felt the boy's skin, ice at the surface, yet with a hidden, perilous warmth in the center that had to be coaxed back to life. He checked faces, named the obvious needs in the mind the way a carpenter names tools. Hypothermia, he thought, exposure, possible frostbite. They needed blankets, heat, transport, the kind of practical sequence that refused sentiment. The dilemma was immediate and raw. The squad's truck could take them, if they made room, if they risked their mobility for strangers, if they put the children ahead of the orders couriered from a warm command post. There were other risks. German soldiers might return. Patrols could be in the area. And every minute the truck lingered was a minute less the unit had to complete its reconnaissance. McKnight looked up at his men. Davies' jaw tightened. Patterson's eyes were unnaturally wet. He shifted a photograph in his breast as if it were a talisman. Kowalski made no movement, but he made himself the first to lift a child to safety. "Sergeant," Wilson said quietly, "we can take 6 without crowding the cab. The rest," his hand swept the basement, "we can fit on the flat, but that's slow." McKnight understood the calculations. He also understood another thing. Orders were for armies, not for the small human demands that stood at a stairway. He had been a farmer once, and men who worked land knew the sound of children's stomachs when the cold came. He had 3 of his own back in Manitoba who would have been in his arms if they had been there. He felt the angle in his chest that men feel when they must choose the smaller scale of mercy over the larger scale of duty. He made the choice. "Get them up," he said. "We'll take them." They worked quickly. The children were lifted one by one, some limp and needing stoking to consciousness, some weeping and shaking in a way that broke the men's reserve. The soldiers shed their own scarves and coats, wrapping them loosely around bodies that had little room. Private Patterson unpeeled his own socks and placed them against a child's feet, an absurdly small comfort. Kowalski carried 2 on his back, the children's legs dangling like bundles. Davies strapped a blanket over a small cluster and sat with them to hold heat. There were moments of near chaos. A child pushed at a strap. A woman's voice from a distance called and stopped. The possible threat of a patrol pushed at the edges of their attention. Through it all, McKnight moved with the calm of someone who decided and would not be turned. Back at the truck, they found that taking 18 children meant a reconfiguration. The cab had space for a few. The flatbed, with the canvas pulled low, could be turned into a huddled shelter. McKnight issued orders in the short, precise bursts that kept people moving. "Wilson, get the radio. Davies, you and Patterson keep the calico kids wrapped. Kowalski, help me with the little ones. Everyone else, blankets, now." Wilson's hands shook as he tweaked the set. The radio came alive with the thin, reedy voice of the command post, distant and administrative. McKnight keyed the transmission and gave the bare facts. They had found civilians, required permission to transport to the nearest Allied medical station, estimated time and route. There was a pause, full of static. Then the answer cracked through. "Negative, Sergeant McKnight. Orders are to maintain mobility. No civilian transport unless specifically authorized. Report coordinates and continue mission." The voice held the tone of a man who handled logistics for a living. Empathy had been trimmed to the minimal. McKnight felt something like frost in his gut. He had expected resistance. He had not expected it to sound so clean, so indisputable. He tried again. "These are children," he said. 18, basement of the old school. Their condition, some are critically hypothermic. We cannot leave them here." There was a longer pause. Wilson shifted on his heels. In the open, the wind took away the edge of McKnight's words, and the voice on the radio came back with the same procedural cadence. "Sergeant, I repeat, mission priorities override local civilian rescue. You will report and proceed." McKnight looked at the children bundled on the flat, their chests rising and falling in ragged, small increments. He looked at his men. The calculation in his head was a ledger. Complete the mission, perhaps keep the unit alive, or feed the ledger with the weight of 18 small human bodies. The ledger was paper in a command post far away, while human temperatures were failing beside him. He felt his voice change into the kind of voice he used when ordering men into danger because it was necessary, a voice that made the danger necessary. "Then consider us out of communication for a bit," he said. "We're taking them. Inform someone that we're moving to the aid post. If that draws heat, so be it." There was a crackle of surprise on the line, a low intake that might have been the operator guessing his commander's face. Then the voice hardened. "That is not within your authority, Sergeant. You will comply with orders." McKnight's reply was quiet, the sort that carried through more in its steadiness than in volume. "We will not." There was a silence long enough for the wind to seem to carry itself louder. His choice had consequences he did not yet know. He felt them like shifting ice underfoot, an unknown weight building. He also felt a deeper conviction that had nothing to do with regulations. It had to do with the immediacy of dying children and the impossibility of answering to a future set of papers when a small heart stopped now. He made another call, not to the command post, but to the nearest medical station, a field hospital set up behind their lines where nurses worked with the efficiency of people who had seen too much. The medic answered with a voice steadier, perhaps because she was closer to the smell of blood and the warmth of ovens. McKnight explained their coordinates, what they had found, and what they needed. There was a brief negotiation. Space, supplies, the possibility of triage over the next hours. She said they could absorb some, but they were stretched thin. McKnight knew they would accept anyone whose condition demanded it. The field hospitals had no stomach for claim jumping when a child was at the edge. As they loaded, the men improvised heat where they could. Engines were kept alive as long as possible, their warmth pushed toward the flatbed with improvised canvas tunnels. The children were arranged to maximize shared body heat. Soldiers pressed against them, sharing their own breath. Patterson unwrapped a bar of chocolate he had smuggled in a pocket and broke it into small pieces. The taste of cocoa in a child's mouth was not medicine, but it did what small rituals do. It made them remember sweetness. Davies hummed under his breath, a low, tuneless sound that filled the pauses like a blanket. They traveled on snow-choked roads, every mile an exercise in attention. There were moments of peril. A village where the sky opened and a flurry of movement suggested patrols. A frozen ford that looked like it might take the truck if they misjudged the ice. They kept to side tracks, to the shadows between hedges, choosing routes that offered cover even if they cost time. Time, though, was the one they were using to buy life. Inside the truck, the children's breath fogged the air. Some slept, curled in the arms of strangers. A boy with a thin face, no more than 10, kept his eyes open, watching the men as if measuring whether they would hold fast. He had a scar on his lip and the edges of his gloves were blackened. McKnight took him a small sip from a flask that had tea warmed against the engine. The boy's fingers closed around it with the precise, greedy hunger of someone unused to receiving kindness. At a checkpoint short of the field hospital, they were stopped. A small detachment, faces pale from cold and nerves, asked for papers. McKnight gave them the terse, necessary answers: unit designation, purpose, and the unvarnished truth. The soldier searching the truck could not do more than meet the eyes of the children and look away. For a moment, procedure and the immediate truth pressed against each other like two hands trying to hold a fragile thing from either side. They were let through when the man understood they were not looting or spy riding, but rescuing. There were no salutes, only the small human relief of recognition. When they arrived at the field hospital, the first lights were dabs of warmth against the gray. Nurses and orderlies moved like people trained to take precise action without letting their private feelings leak in. They directed the men with quiet commands. Blankets were carried, stretches of electricity hummed, and an EMT with a steady hand measured core temperatures. They murmured terms: critical, moderate, observe, and arranged space where urgent care could be given. The medical response was brisk. Those with dangerously low core temperatures were brought under heated blankets and placed near hot water bottles. Their clothing was removed and replaced with dry layers. Their hands and feet were warmed gradually. There was no sensational rescue theater, only the clinical choreography of triage. Prioritize airway, breathing, circulation, then the subtler concerns of frostbite and secondary infection. A nurse held the smallest of the children's hands and spoke in a low voice, the kind that tried to stitch sense into trauma. McKnight kept to the margins, his eyes on the monitors, his fingers tightening at his side. Not all were saved without cost. Some showed signs of severe frostbite in their fingers and toes, darkened areas that would, in time, likely lead to surgical removal. The surgeons spoke of these decisions with a factual cruelty that came from repetition. "We'll do everything we can," the surgeon said, "but some tissues may be beyond saving." McKnight heard it and felt a strange private collapse. He had wanted to take them away from a basement to a place of warmth. The decision had been made, and yet the cost was real and abiding. News traveled, the way news does in war, through the ranks, through field cables, and eventually to a small wire that ran to a press tent. Word of the rescue became a thread that the military could not entirely ignore. There would be an inquiry called. The command chain would examine decisions and record what had been done against the ledger of orders. The men, for their part, kept moving in the present. They stayed to help, to wash, to organize spare clothing. They sat through the night and held the children as nurses gave instructions, and parents, if any survived to claim them, did not appear. The inquiry that followed was, at first, a formality. Officers recorded statements. Who found the children? What time transmissions were made? Who authorized the transport? McKnight recounted the facts with a soldier's clarity, what he had seen and what he had done, trying to make his choice legible in a ledger that valued obedience. Davies and Wilson offered corroboration. Patterson's statement trembled on the page with little more than him saying, "They couldn't be left." Kowalski provided terse sentences that read in the record like a flat stone. Command considered the case with the bureaucratic rigor of institutions that must constrain empathy for the sake of order. They weighed operational priorities against the moral imperative inherent to human life. They noted the strain that civilian rescue placed on supply lines and the precedent it could set. Yet, the field hospital's reports, detailing the conditions of the children and their subsequent survival rates, made a quiet argument of their own. Numbers have power in a military ledger. A tally of lives saved was as persuasive as any regulation. While the paperwork unfolded, press coverage moved in its own time. A correspondent in the field wrote a dispatch that mentioned Canadian discipline and the unlikely reality of soldiers turned rescuers. The piece did not assign motives beyond what could be seen. Men who had found children and moved them to safety. The story was a small thing in the immense throb of the war, yet for those who read it, it reframed the image of a soldier as an instrument not solely of destruction, but of rescue. For Sergeant McKnight, there was no dramatic court-martial, no headline that forced a public reckoning. What happened instead was quieter. The inquiry concluded with a notation. The decision had violated standing orders but had been made in circumstances that called for immediate human judgment. The command chose not to punish. They also chose not to write a commendation. It was a middle path, an institutional shrug that recognized the reality on the ground without turning it into official policy. The men returned to duty with an understanding that their action had been noted and set aside, in the manner of things that could not be ignored but could not be systematized either. The long-term consequences unfolded more slowly. Some of the children regained warmth and appetite, and the hospital's records showed that a majority survived their immediate crisis. A few required later surgeries for frost-damaged tissue. That fact lived as a quiet sorrow in the files and in McKnight's dreamscapes. Years later, when reunions were arranged in small ways by aid groups and local papers, a handful of those saved would be found and spoken to. Some of the children grew into adults who would tell versions of the day that mixed gratitude with formative trauma. The survivors' testimonials carried the compact truth. A group of men had chosen them over the abstraction of orders, and that choice bent the trajectory of their lives. For McKnight, life moved on in ways that were both ordinary and altered. He returned to duties and then to civilian life. He never sought out praise. The small, private commendation came in the form of letters, some mailed years later from the children's families, sometimes official notes that took the rather awkward shape of delayed recognition. In one letter, a woman who had been the smallest child in the basement wrote in halting English about her garden and the smallness of her hands. She signed it with a name McKnight did not at first recognize, and then, with a sentence that folded memory into present, she wrote, "You kept us warm." The incident did not upend military procedure, nor did it instantly rewrite policy manuals. But it entered the ledger of practice as an example, used in quiet briefings to remind commanders that rules serve war, but that discretion will always be demanded where human beings press against orders. Some medics cited the case in later training as a moment when triage systems had to reckon not only with wounds, but with the moral calculus of saving lives under constraint. Policy committees considered the incident in handwritten minutes, discussion that rarely translated into decisive action, but that nudged thinking toward incorporating civilian rescue in contingency planning. In the end, the story was not about institutional vindication or judicial clarity. It was about the small arithmetic of human choices. It was about a sergeant who listened to a sound and decided that the life of a child was a duty more immediate than any line on a map. It was about soldiers who, in a time of unrelenting orders and movement, chose to make space in a truck for warmth and for life. At night, long after the war, McKnight would wake and find that memory like a thin, persistent cold, one that did not numb but kept him attentive. In bars and in quiet kitchens, men who had been with him would reminisce about the small things that mattered: a bar of chocolate shared in a truck, a nurse who hummed a lullaby in a tent, the grip of a child's hand on a soldier's sleeve. These were the details that did the real work of meaning, the things that made the moral choice visible in ordinary human acts. There was a modest recognition years later when a small plaque was placed near the site of the ruined school, the wording pragmatic and without flourish, a record of lives saved. It did not tell the whole story, no plaque could, but it gave place to memory, and memory, in turn, shaped how a village told itself about those days of smoke and snow. Even as greater histories rolled on, the rescue remained a concentrated example of moral clarity under pressure. It asked no theatrical question, it offered a model, that obedience and humanity are sometimes at odds, and that the cost of choosing humanity may be measured in practical consequences that institutions must reckon with later. It left open, as all such stories do, a room for reflection on whether rules must be absolute or whether the better rule is one that leaves space for judgment. At the hospital, one boy, the one who had watched the men with a suspicious measurement of their worth, recovered enough to grin at McKnight and offer what little he had, a dried piece of bread saved like a treasure. McKnight took it and swallowed the taste of that small human economy, gratitude, barter, and the quiet proof that someone had chosen them in the cold. The men who had done the choosing returned to their lines carrying, among their other gear, the weight of what they had not known they would carry after that day. The war continued, inexorable and vast, but in the narrower geography of broken towns and tired humans, the rescue left a mark that was impossible to dismiss, an instance where the urgency of life demanded disobedience, and where those who disobeyed did so without fanfare and without expectation beyond the need to act. The story circulated in a handful of dispatches and in the private correspondence of men and women who had witnessed it. It would surface decades later in oral histories, in veteran interviews, where voices softened and hardened at once as the tellers tried to give shape to what they had done. For historians, it came to embody a moral question as practical as any strategic calculation: how a small group of individuals negotiates the tension between duty to orders and duty to persons. The winter that had been so merciless thawed eventually, as winters do, and fields reopened to seed and to the indifferent cycles of life. The schoolhouse was repaired in time, stones set back into place, and a bell, minded by children who had outlived that winter, rang in mornings that felt, at first, like unearned absolution. In those rings there was an echo of the night. The men had pulled children out of a basement and warmed them with the heat of engines and hands and simple, stubborn human will. McKnight kept a photograph folded into a small worn wallet. A girl with eyes like a coal bright in ash, smiling awkwardly, wrapped in a blanket too large for her thin shoulders. Whenever he thought of those days, he remembered the smallness and the largeness at once. The press of cold against skin, the taste of chocolate, the hum of a radio that said no, and then the larger murmuring of human decision that said yes. He did not tell himself grand stories about courage. He told himself what he had done, and why, and how it felt to be on the side of warmth. The record of the rescue remained, in official files, as a notation among many. In the lives of those saved, it was a hinge. The moral question it posed continued to be asked in different forms: in orders given, in choices made beneath them, and in the slow work of recovery that followed war. The answer had been simple and immediate. They had chosen life. They turned the truck back toward the road when the children were safe under the tents of the medical station. The engine grumbled awake with the sound of something that had been kept alive. McKnight sat in the driver's seat for a long while, staring at the frost on the glass, and then, without any public pronouncement, he wiped his hands and started the engine. The world outside remained raw and demanding. Inside, for a handful of people, warmth had been bought with the risk of disobedience. The cost would be tallied and retallied in reports and minutes. But in the small ledger of human lives, the balance had been made. He drove until the road loosened from the memory of the tents and the smell of kerosene, and then folded itself into the monotony of supply runs. Mud, frozen ruts, the occasional line of carts. The truck carried on. The men fell into their places as if they had only been away for an extra hour. There was no cheer, no confession of triumph. The warmth they had given remained between them like an unspoken agreement. Reports came the way reports always came, shoved across a desk, copied, indexed. McKnight wrote what he could without making it a sermon. He put names where names mattered and left out the parts that would have made a file indelicate. Others wrote differently. A corporal on duty that night added a notation about unauthorized evacuation with the stiff ink of a man who was practiced in doing his duty by the book. A field surgeon kept a short, precise record of injuries and of who had saved whom. The medical records would always say triage performed under adverse conditions, neutral and tidy. The people who mattered, those children, the nurses under the tent flap, the driver who had shared his blanket, kept their own, and those private ledgers were the ones that did most of the counting. She learned to teach reading in a school that had been mended with hands less hurried than the hands that had repaired the roof that winter. McKnight carried on with his tasks. He stole moments when he could to look at the photograph that lived folded and worn in his wallet. He would sit at the back of a truck while others sorted rations and let the image press against the inside of his palm as if to remind him of a human geometry that was not reducible to ranks. He refused medals when they were offered. There were no formal offers, only hints in the voices of men who thought courtesy would be a good substitute for admiration. Gratitude, he thought, could never be measured in ribbon. He allowed himself instead the quiet satisfaction of knowing, with a fullness that did not need witnesses, that they had chosen life. Decades later, when the war had receded into the way large things recede, by becoming stories told by those who had time enough to smooth the edges, McKnight found that the world wanted tidy versions of what had been loose and dangerous. Historians came with notebooks and with the smell of paper. Journalists came with sharper questions and a hunger for a single, headlineable moral. They asked repeatedly whether the men had disobeyed deliberately, whether they had believed themselves to be right, whether they had considered the consequences. McKnight answered as he had before, with the smallness of detail. He told them of the cold that made decisions literal, of the way a child's hand fit into the crook of a soldier's, of the taste of stale bread offered with reverence. He did not frame his answer in doctrine. The children the men had saved grew and multiplied. Some left the village when doors beyond opened. Some stayed. The girl with the coal-bright eyes became, as the years softened her, a teacher who told children simple truths about numbers and letters and about the bell that must be rung. She kept in a drawer a rolled strip of cloth that had once wrapped a small piece of bread. Sometimes she would take it out and rub it between thumb and forefinger as if to feel the shape of that first generosity once more. On a spring morning nearly 30 years after the rescue, when the schoolhouse had been painted a color much lighter than the grays of the war, and the bell was the thing that marked the schedule of a village at peace, the children rang it with a clamor that seemed almost proud of itself. McKnight was there by invitation, a man whose hair had silvered and whose hands had less sturdiness than they once had. He walked slowly up the path, holding the photograph in his palm like an offering. The girl, no longer a child, but with the same small gravity, met him at the gate. She did not run to him in his wayward heroics. Instead, she extended a hand and took his photograph as if she were borrowing a relic. "You saved us," she said, simply, the words falling neither as accusation nor as exaltation. but as a factual accounting. McKnight smiled in a way that was not the smile of victory, but of settlement. "We chose warmth," he said, smaller still, "and it proved enough." There was a brief crowd then, not to make ceremony, but to make the ordinary act of thanks. Bread was offered in platters. A child pushed forward a simple wooden toy someone had carved from a leftover crate. There was no parade, only a table beneath the schoolhouse eaves where people sat and traded the soft trade of memory, names, weather, small embarrassments. That night McKnight slept the easy sleep of a man who had spent himself once and had no urge to spend more. Time, which had already done its work, performed its last decencies. McKnight's later years were slow and gentle. He walked the village lanes with a stick and an absence of ambition. He listened to the bell on morning and was more inclined to pause than to hurry. His comrades, thin with age as he was, kept to their corners and to the ways men preserve modest dignity. When the inevitable came, it came without drama. An afternoon seated in a chair by a window, the light falling like a page across the photograph in his lap. He reached for the wallet with fingers that remembered the shape of that girl's face, and he tucked the photograph into the hand of the woman who had once been that child. "Keep it," he said, "so you know." She did not promise anything that might sound like rescue. She simply nodded. And because adults sometimes keep small ceremonies to mark what cannot be repaired, she folded the photograph into the pages of a book, a primer for the children, its letters already rubbed thin by the teaching hands, and set it on a shelf where little eyes might find it. The funeral was small and careful. The bell in the schoolhouse rang once, a clear note that did not seek to eulogize with pomp. Those who had been warmed that winter came, in varying numbers, and they laid sprigs of wild grass on the coffin because that was how the village marked the passing of someone who had done a necessary thing. There were quiet words spoken about the law and about conscience. There were also stories of the mundane, how his hands had fixed a gate, how he had never taken more than his fair share of wood. Stories, which are the honest currency of remembrance, were traded like bread. Afterwards, in the schoolroom where children learned the simple arithmetic of the world, the photograph was taken down and shown to a small cluster of youngsters with the directness of those who pass along what must be known. He kept warmth, the teacher said. He did what needed to be done. A boy in the back asked the question every boy in every age asks. "Were you scared?" The teacher, who had once been the child under a blanket, looked at the photograph and then at the boy. "Sometimes," she said, "but sometimes you are more afraid not to act." The bell rang that morning as it had for years, and the sound moved through the village in a way that made old men look up from their porches and made mothers pause in their doorways. It was, in the modest geometry of that place, a signal that time went on, and that some things, decisions, small mercies, the tending of the young, wove themselves into the fabric in a way that made the fabric stronger. If histories later wrote volumes, and if analysts set the rescue against columns of statistics and doctrinal argument, the village kept its own accounting. It measured the event not in punishments or in commendations, but in the work that followed. The repaired schoolhouse, the bell that rang, the children who learned how to add and to read, and, in their quieter lessons, how to weigh the cost of kindness. The men who had chosen life were not immortalized in marble. They were remembered in stool chairs, in the way wood smoke made a particular face of warmth against the cold, in a photograph kept in a primer on a low shelf where small hands could one day find it. And so the moral would continue to be asked in new ways, by officers who wrote reports, by pastors who tried to teach obedience, by teachers who wanted children to grow into citizens who could both follow and, when necessary, pause. The answer remained as it had always been in that small ledger of human lives, that in a moment when doctrine met desperate need, some chose the immediate imperative of saving, and that their choice, measured by the pulse of its consequence, had been to choose life. There was no trumpet. There was, instead, the ordinary succession of days, the bell each morning, the children who learned, the fields that yielded seed, and under all of it the knowledge that a night of smoke and snow had once been met with hands that would not let heat be a private thing. The photograph faded in time, but its corners were smoothed by fingers that had passed it from hand to hand. The story was told again and again in the village, not as an argument, but as a way of explaining how the world at its best was kept going. McKnight's wallet emptied and closed. The primer stayed on the shelf. The bell kept its rhythm. The men who once had to choose between order and life went on being, stubbornly and ungrandly, human.